We know now that Putin is not about to roll across Ukraine. I mean, he's having enough trouble just simply taking the eastern Donbas region. So we're not going to face a situation where Russian tanks roll all the way to the Romanian border, for example. Nor are we likely to be in a position in which actually the Ukrainians can kick every single Russian out of every single square centimeter of Ukrainian soil and also impose such a devastating blow against Russia that it doesn't ever think about restarting this war. So unfortunately, victory, peace, all of these things are going to fall somewhere in that wide and unsatisfactory gap between those two extremes.
The UN General Assembly is this week. Huge meeting. Manhattan basically shuts down. I lived there a few years ago for about a year. Manhattan sort of shuts down for this huge jamboree of all sorts of leaders from right across the world, including President Zelensky, who will be there. President of the United States, Starmer, will be there at some point as well. And indeed, Zelensky will be meeting Biden in Washington. And Volodymyr Zelensky says he's unveiling a plan for victory in the war with Russia. But what does that actually look like? What does the end of this war look like? Well, the Russia analyst and founder of the consultancy firm Mayak Intelligence, Mark Galeotti, has written about it in the Sunday Times.
The issue has really been for a long time that no one really wants to talk directly about how this ends. And clearly, President Zelensky of Ukraine is very keen that his particular vision triumphs. And so he has moved from creating a peace plan that was not really a peace plan in the sense of there was no way that Russia was going to accept it, not least because it included one clause about war crimes tribunals that would essentially have required President Putin to put himself on a plane to The Hague and hand him over to a tribunal. That wasn't going to happen. But in some ways, that wasn't the point. The point was to start to try and flesh out how Kyiv wanted to see this end and to try and make sure that all the Western allies are on board. So now we have a new plan, a victory plan that's meant to be unveiled next week in the United States, which again, it's unclear how far it's really going to be a solid practical roadmap or how far it's more going to be a statement of how Ukraine wants it to end, wants the war to end, and what it'll expect from its Western partners to achieve that.
There's a couple of paragraphs within this piece that really stood out for me. One of them, let me just start with, is Western support for Ukraine, you write, for all its high-flown rhetoric, is limited and uncertain. This is precisely why Zelensky is unveiling his plan in this manner. Can you just explain that further to us? Because I think that really unlocks this whole issue for us.
There's a lot of very impressive-sounding rhetoric about Western assistance to Ukraine that clearly does not actually match the reality. And in some ways, we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, it's not as if we are actually fully willing to do everything that Ukraine needs. We are not, for example, willing to send our own combat troops to go and fight and die, and in effect, to start a much wider war with Russia, a nuclear power, let's remember. Yeah, and we also have all kinds of other economic and geopolitical interests and such like. So we talk about providing Ukraine with whatever it needs. Instead, we're not. And in many ways, we're actually carefully metering the amount of assistance we provide and also how that can be used in order to maintain the cohesion of the Western alliance, because there are some countries that are a lot more wobbly than others, but also to try and manage how the conflict evolves. And the Ukrainians, however much they absolutely appreciate the massive amount of support that they've been given, but nonetheless, they also resent this gap between our rhetoric and our actions. And so a lot of Zelensky's work is involved in, frankly, trying to push the West, sometimes by cajoling, sometimes by browbeating, but one way or the other, his job is to push the West, not only to maintain the current level of support, but to extend it and to progressively lift the various limitations that have been placed upon how Ukraine uses the weapons it's been provided.
It's really interesting as well. Just another bit that came out of the article for me was really what I think you're hinting towards there, and that answer about Ukraine fatigue there, and also a growing sense that maybe time to end the war, even if this means creating an ugly peace. In part, that's because the West has never properly considered what victory means. Why is that per se? Because there does seem to be a lot of funding, lots of money. The UK has given another 600 million recently without saying actually, how does this end? Is that just because it's such a difficult conversation, and what might be acceptable to one country, of course, might not be the same to others, not least Ukraine?
one of the shocking failures, I would suggest, of the West is precisely to have the difficult conversations about how this ends early. Now, it's all very well us saying, well, the war ends when Ukraine says it'll end and how Ukraine says it'll end. But actually, we have to be honest and recognize that, of course, there are limitations. And one of the key priorities in the West has been to maintain solidarity, that pretty much every NATO and Western country, with the possible exception of Hungary, has been pretty much online with supporting Ukraine to the current level. But there are all sorts of divisions within the West, not only about how this ends, but also about how important it is. If you are in Italy or Spain, for example, the real security risk that you think you face actually comes from the Middle East or from North Africa. Whereas clearly, if you're in Poland or the Baltic states, both countries that actually have in living memory experience of being under Moscow's control, you have a very different perspective about the real threat coming from the East. So in some ways, in order precisely to not risk the unity of the West, we have dodged the whole question of quite what victory means. Because we know now that Putin is not about to roll across Ukraine. I mean, he's having enough trouble just simply taking the eastern Donbas region. So we're not going to face a situation where Russian tanks roll all the way to the Romanian border, for example. Nor are we likely to be in a position in which actually the Ukrainians can kick every single Russian out of every single square centimeter of Ukrainian soil, and also impose such a devastating blow against Russia that it doesn't ever think about restarting this war. So unfortunately, victory, peace, all of these things are going to fall somewhere in that wide and unsatisfactory gap between those two extremes. But as I say, this is not something on the whole that the West is willing to talk about.
Tell us about America. The election there, if the polls are to be believed, is on a knife edge between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. What does victory for each of those candidates mean for Ukraine in your estimation?
Well, look, if Kamala Harris wins, essentially all the signs we've had is that it will be a continuity. So in other words, policy won't really change. Because frankly, she's never really been that involved in foreign policy. She's likely to inherit largely the same foreign policy team with some sort of changes at the very top. So, basically, it is likely to continue as is. Of course, the wildcard candidate is Donald Trump. Now, he claims that he will bring the war to an end, or at least to a ceasefire, very quickly by threatening Moscow that if it doesn't accept a ceasefire, he will massively increase the amount of aid going to Ukraine, and by threatening Kyiv that if it doesn't accept a ceasefire, which, let's be honest, President Zelensky has explicitly ruled out so far, then the threat is that he will massively reduce aid. And let's be honest, if America reduces its aid on that kind of a scale, this is not something that Europe can make up the shortfall. So that will be catastrophic. But we also have to recognize that there tends to be a rather substantial gulf between what Trump says and what Trump does. For all his effusive talk about Putin during his first presidential term, in practice, American policy towards Russia at the end of his presidency was tougher than at any point since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this is one of the reasons why Zelensky is unveiling his victory plan now, to try and lock in lots and lots of assistance and a general consensus within the West as to how this ends, long before the risk of there being a return to the presidency of Donald Trump.
The absolutely peerless Mark Galeotti, just explaining that brilliantly, giving a totally balanced, straightforward view on all of the many complex elements that are at play here. And he's written about it in the Sunday Times. Highly recommend that. You can read it in the paper today, or of course look online if you've got a digital subscription at thetimes.com.